Thank you guys, and thank you again for the award. It was definitely unexpected, and we didn't realize that a long enough time had gone past to survive the test of time. So it reminds you of how we all get older, I guess. So this is a quick recap of some of the work we did on Roofnet about 10 or 15 years ago. And I'm going to share some of the research results since it's been a while since the paper was published. And it's interesting to see how, even though the technology has changed, a lot of the conclusions are still very relevant. When Andrew was organizing the speakers, he actually asked us to think of a funny fact. And I was actually at MIT about last month, and I was taking a nostalgic walk around, and I noticed a bunch of our research artifacts were still up. So these photos are actual Roofnet antennas that are still up all over Cambridge. And believe it or not, some of them are still beaconing away, like the Voyager spacecraft. So if you guys are at MIT at any point, open up your laptop, and that long list of SSIDs, you might see Roofnet. So this is all joint work done at MIT. John, Dan, myself, and I were graduate students. Robert was our advisor. And I'll be around if there are any questions about it afterwards. So the motivation behind Roofnet was we were curious if there was a way to provide free internet access using unlicensed radios. And the reason we focused on unlicensed radios is we were doing this work 30 years after AlohaNet. And at that point, people figured out the value of spectrum. The big carriers were basically bidding with the FCC hundreds of millions of dollars for little pieces of spectrum. And that kind of left unlicensed for us researchers. And really, we were curious about the intellectual potential of this. Could you take what was otherwise kind of throwaway spectrum and deliver something of immense value over it by doing kind of clever software tricks, networking tricks? So this was kind of the world that we were coming from. We saw a picture where there was this amazing licensed spectrum where you could blast away at kilowatts of energy. And then there was this unlicensed spectrum where we all had to play by the FCC's rules, which has also now made Wi-Fi popular. At the time, by the way, Wi-Fi had still not been branded. It was still 802.11. So a little bit of a different world. So our kind of tactic here was, of course, to use multi-hop routing. And by building a mesh, we could get around shadowing and other obstacles from the physical environment. So instead of having a big tower on top of a mountaintop or the tallest building in Boston, we thought, well, maybe we can put antennas on roofs and kind of route around different shadowing and trees and so on, and actually outperform direct line of sight. And that was really the research question is, can this type of system work? And can it work well enough to provide internet access? Because turns out people have a pretty high standard for internet access, and it's a little bit different than mesh networking, for example, on the sensor side, where you might be able to tolerate delays and losses because you're not really going to look at that graph instantly. With internet access, people really want it to be instant. So we set a high bar. And on the face of it, at the time when the research was started, we actually got a lot of criticism. Hey, isn't this sort of a solved problem? People know how to build networks. This is, after the year 2000, people have been building networks 25, 30 years. Can't we just essentially use existing routing protocols? And that was kind of the state of the art. And there were various models around what radio propagation looked like. And yes, there were some challenges and trade-offs. But in general, if you pick the shortest path, you should get the lowest delay. You should get the best throughput. And that's kind of where we were coming from. So now that I've given you guys some historical context, I'm going to walk through what our experimental details look like, with the equipment we were using and so on, talk about some of the surprising findings, and then reflect a little bit on what this looks like 10 years later. So a quick look at the hardware. These pictures are not as cool as the ones from the 1970s, but these are scanned photos, so they're historical and authentic. But this is what our antenna looked like. You saw them on the rooftop. That's where they ultimately were mounted. But basically an outdoor weatherproof antenna. It had about an 8 dBi gain. There was a 50-foot low-loss cable that would run down. And then we had a little box that was basically a PC running Linux that would sit in a graduate student's living room and essentially act as the gateway or the modem. It was very much a standard PC at the time, so about 500 megahertz, had a decent amount of RAM and had a hard disk and CD-ROM that we were able to put our software on to distribute it and so on. And one interesting side note is this was very much a live system. At its peak, it had, I think, over 100 nodes that were active. We had about 600 graduate students that would use this. And if there was a hiccup, even for 5 minutes, we were Comcast. They would call us, and somehow they found our phone number and would actually show up in our office like, hey, I couldn't use the internet last night, that sort of thing. So we had to make the system very robust, and this is in spite of us doing research on it. So we had to learn how do you do research on a live system, roll out routing protocol updates, change your entire packet header format, do upgrades, and occasionally when you brick the devices, how do you fix them? So kind of problems like that. So that CD-ROM, as antiquated as it looks now, was actually very helpful because I did at one point walk the entire city of Cambridge handing out CDs to all of our volunteers and asked them, could you put that in the device and hit reboot? Because we need to reflash the whole node. So fun stuff. This is what the network looked like. At the time that we wrote the MobiCom paper, there were about 37 nodes in the system. As I mentioned, it did scale further to about 100, 110. This was the third network that we built. The first one was an indoor network in the lab for computer science. That was between 01 and 03. Then we took it outdoors, and then we upgraded it over time in terms of hardware to what you saw in the picture. And we observed a lot of interesting phenomena. So the link behavior, I think, was probably the most interesting of all and very surprising. And all the crazy colors you see on the screen, these are all the links that appeared in our network between the various nodes color-coded. So blue is a very strong link delivered 100% of its packets. Red or orange is 10 or 0%. And then all the intermediate colors represent the intermediate links. And I'll talk about these on a graph. So that was a big surprise. The other was, as I mentioned, we had real users, about a few hundred grad students, and real workloads. In other words, BitTorrent and other fun protocols that we had not expected. Because in academic research, we thought, oh, there's just some normal distribution of payload sizes and all that stuff. Turns out BitTorrent would just use all the bandwidth on the network if we weren't careful. So that was actually very helpful for us because it helped us make sure our system was robust. And then I talked a little bit about things like the upgrades. So this whole system took us years to build, from 2001 to 2006, so about a 5-year undertaking. And we were probably the only grad students in the CS department that owned a 40-foot ladder and would climb up it and install antennas. So it is a lot of work, and for all the grad students in the audience, it feels grueling. But when the results come out, it's just a lot of fun. So I mentioned the intermediate links. This is a plot of what all those links look like, plotted in a slightly different view. On the x-axis, you see the signal strength. On the y-axis is the delivery ratio. And the reason this plot is significant is at the time, about 10, 15 years ago, a lot of the models that people were doing research off of were theoretic. In other words, there was a signal-noise ratio. If you were above that threshold, it was very likely that you would see all the packets come through. If you're below the threshold, very few of the packets would come through. There's bit error rate and so on. But if we talk about percentages, that transition period was very, very small. I think one thing that's surprising to us is even though there wasn't a lot of noise at the rooftop level, or even if you measured over long periods of time, we would consistently see these intermediate link delivery rates. And this had, of course, implications in terms of how the routing protocol would work. In other words, if you were just doing advertisements, it was almost always the case that it was those 10% links that looked really good. They were very long distance, and then you try to route all your packets over it, and you have a problem. So we need to figure out new models for how do we actually measure these links. And then we developed a method where we essentially, instead of trying to predict, we ended up just measuring and advertising what these links, what they actually perform. So that was interesting. The other interesting thing we discovered was the radios that we were using were 802.11b radios, which now feel a little out of date, but they were the first radios that we could get our hands on that had multiple modulations or bit rates to select. A lot of the radios being used in research at the time were fixed modulation, like BPSK, something very simple. 802.11b actually had a very high speed mode, which was 11 megabits. And so we would try things like experiments where we would just broadcast out, see the link delivery rates of different modulations. And we saw surprising things, like sometimes it's actually better to use a 5.5 megabit bit rate with a certain amount of loss versus 11 megabit bit rate and so on. This has since become a bigger problem with newer radios that have many, in fact, I think about 100 modulations now to choose from with MIMO and so on. But in our system, we had 4 to pick from, and it wasn't entirely obvious which one to use. So we tried static bit rate for a while, that didn't work. Then we tried the dynamic one, the card came up, that didn't work. And then John ended up actually writing his entire master's thesis on how do you pick one of these bit rates. So interesting kind of real world problem. And all of this was relevant in the multi-hop context because we were really trying to answer this question of what's the best way to route through the network. you take one very long hop or two shorter hops at a higher speed. And because of the loss rates, you can actually see one of your very long hops might actually only deliver 10 kilobits or kilobytes per second, whereas two of your short hops might deliver 200 kilobytes per second. So even accounting for delay of taking that extra hop, it might be better to take two hops instead of one. So the way we to summarize the paper in one sentence, we use periodic measurements to estimate the transmission count. So we actually built up a basic model based on measurements of how long it would take for a packet to successfully make it across a hop, and then communicated that out as a route metric. And it turns out it was very simple, but it worked and it was robust, and we were able to deploy that across the entire network and use it for a long time. So this is a look at the results. We were extremely excited to finally be able to quantify what a difference the routing metrics made. So on the screen you see a CDF. On the x-axis is packets per second. These are every 1,000 byte packets. And then on the y-axis is the CDF fraction. The red circle indicates the set of routes in the multi-hop network that went from being completely unusable to actually usable. Now the performance may not be that huge, probably 20% of the peak performance of radio link, but this was the difference between being able to deliver access and not. And if you think about the original mission of the project, we wanted to make sure all of these students could get connected. And so we were able to achieve that by actually just developing a better routing metric and then subsequent routing protocols. So we had an impact on that bottom 20-30%, but almost across the board for about 75% of our links we increased performance. As the network got bigger, this effect became more profound. I couldn't find a plot when we had 100 nodes in the network, but if we had run kind of a shortest path algorithm, I would say something like 60% of the routes would not have worked because they would try to go over very long, very lossy links. But what we did find is with ETT and ETX, the routing metrics we developed, almost every single route was usable. And that's how we got REST students to stop showing up in routes. So in the last couple of minutes here, just a quick look back. We saw the radios change a lot over the last 10 years. If you open up a new access point, like the ones used here, they're almost 1,000 times faster than what we were using back then. There's also MIMO and other file layer technologies. You may wonder, does this stuff just kind of go away? Or was that just an artifact of basic radios that were available? And later on, we continued to do some of this work. Some products we built commercially actually continued to run a derivative of our routing protocol. And at SIGCOM last year, we published a paper taking measurements from 10,000 access points, and we found wireless links were still definitely lossy. So it's nice to know that that conclusion didn't erode with time. And then the other thing we noticed is that over time, new things are happening. There's actually a lot more interference out in the air now than there was 10, 15 years ago when we did this work. We saw just in the measurement period of that paper last year, the number of access points doubled in 6 months that each AP was seeing. So I would say the one takeaway here is for all the grad students in the audience, the world is an extremely interesting place if you can start to measure it and do practical research. So it's a lot of work, involves climbing around on ladders and doing all kinds of kind of gritty things, but you get amazing results like this, and I think we're very glad we did it. That's it. Thank you.